Hello and welcome once again to our study of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I'm Father Charles Connor, and I certainly want to welcome you as we consider the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And we're going to see as we go through our material this time that the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, takes in an awful lot more than just taking out a gun and shooting somebody and killing them. The fifth commandment is packed with material for our consideration. In our century, the Catechism begins by telling us there's been a vast growth in our understanding of the human body and of the processes involved in the transmission of human life and indeed in the processes involved in dying. Medical technology has developed to the point where really it's possible for medical personnel to bring about fertilization outside of the body, to diagnose handicap prior to birth, to prolong life at the end through life support machines and all the rest. At the same time, it is very, very possible to destroy life in the womb, to end life deliberately by using drugs, or by omitting procedures which would extend life, quite apart from the very sophisticated ways in which life can be destroyed in war. So a vast array of moral issues, my friends, have to do with human life. We are talking here, the study obviously of bioethics. And there therefore is much for us to consider as we go through the Catechism. The Catechism begins its treatment in paragraph 2258, this cluster of many, many questions, with a simple statement that human life is sacred. And there are three reasons why human life is sacred. Because at its origin, there's always been the creative action of God, because it has always had a special relationship with God, and because it is God and God alone who is the sole end of our lives. Very, very compelling reasons. Naturally enough, the Catechism of the Catholic Church begins with an extraordinarily strong condemnation of murder. That's what we think about when we think about thou shalt not kill. We go back to Scripture, we find our blessed Lord identifying the anger which lies in our hearts and which is the root of killing. He rejects it. It's precisely anger and envy which are at the root of, well, for example, Cain's murder of Abel. The Catechism very rightly traces anger and envy to original sin, as so much can be traced to original sin. Fratricide is condemned, but so is the murder of any man. In the context of the covenant with Noah, we are told that the shedding of blood will demand a reckoning. The one responsible for it shall have his life shed. Now, there's a very, very strong point we have to make here. It's clear, particularly from the book of Exodus, that the fifth precept of the Decalogue, thou shalt not kill, is really indeed a condemnation of murder. We can see that this is very, very well known to our Jewish forebears, and we see that even in the Mosaic Code, we find a very strong condemnation of the slaying of the innocent, the killing of the righteous. So the Catechism, following along in that line, condemns the murder of the innocent, based on our belief in God as the Creator and based on natural law. We saw all the way back in the first section the primordial content of the Decalogue. Whenever that is an issue, such kind of murder is a very, very grave matter. Human life is God's created gift. What lies at the root of the teaching that we have, well, what lies at the root of it is the fact that God is the author of all life. And even those who do not have an explicit religious belief can recognize that our human lives are indeed fundamental human goods. In the light of faith, of course, God's lordship over our human life becomes even clearer. We exist by His creative act, although our parents have cooperated in a unique and marvelous way to bestow on us the magnificent gift of life. In the Scriptures, you know, the unique value of human life is very much expressed with reference to blood as a sacred sign of life. Thus, a murderer will be held responsible for his brother's blood. By contrast, The sealing of the covenant by blood shows the depth of the relationship that God wishes to establish with us. So all of this throws a great deal of light, does it not, on the sacredness of human life, whose dignity is to be seen in the destiny God has planned for every single one of us. St. John Paul II was very, very clear about it in the Gospel of Life. Evangelium Vitae in the Catechism refers to this condemnation. And this condemnation, the universal validity of this condemnation is made very clear, very, very clear in the Catechism. It applies everywhere. It cannot be limited to certain types of persons, to human beings of certain ages or states of health. No, 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 no. It applies to everyone. And it certainly applies to the unborn human being. So, we have much to consider, and the Catechism begins in paragraph 2263 with the topic of legitimate defense and deliberate killing. Now, with legitimate defense, two things are noted immediately. First of all, this is not an exception to the moral norm prohibiting the deliberate, direct killing of the innocent. It is not an exception to that moral norm. And secondly, the right of self-defense is rooted in our duties toward ourselves. This is not a matter of being selfish. It's a recognition that our responsibility to protect innocent human life involves protecting our own. We will see in the Catechism that St. Thomas Aquinas is quoted in this section, and he really provides the classical treatment for understanding this teaching of the Church. He notes, for example, that self-love, now we're not talking self-centeredness, we're talking about taking the proper care of ourselves. Self-love is a demand of morality, and this includes preserving our own life. You may have noticed up to now that the Catechism refers to legitimate defense rather than self-defense. Seems like a small point, but this apparently small point is actually a very important one. This is because our rights and our responsibilities in this area are not limited to ourselves. In fact, if we judged that the only way we could defend ourselves was by killing an aggressor, we might choose not to kill the aggressor out of some kind of a heroic love or heroic motive. Now, the Church recognizes that heroic motive and applauds it, but it would be much harder to justify not killing an aggressor if, for example, he were attacking a child in our care or a disabled person. These two cases would not be self-defense, they would be legitimate defense. And here we would have a very, very grave duty to act. Well, as far as the moral principles involved in legitimate defense, the Catechism puts forth three principles of St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas, first of all, distinguishes between two effects of the same act, an evil one and a good one. And it is important that this is the one moral act. Secondly, he specifies that the intention must be to bring about the good effect. In other words, preserving your life or that of other innocents. And that there must not be an intention to bring about an evil effect. Killing the aggressor, for example. The evil effect must be beyond the intention. And finally, there must be only a proportionate use of force. That is, that it must not be more than is necessary or thought necessary at the time. We really owe it, I think, to St. Thomas Aquinas that we think in terms of this principle of double effect in moral theology, although that principle of double effect has been refined somewhat since his analysis centuries ago. And in particular, another principle that he uses elsewhere is brought in here, that the good end does not justify the use of evil means. A good end does not justify the use of evil means. In other words, the principle of double effect now includes the principle that the good effect must not be brought about through the evil effect. Why? Well, that would be using evil to do good. And we are never permitted to use evil to do good. In fact, it is not clear, really, that the principle of double effect operates strictly in legitimate defense, although it does in other cases. St. Thomas Aquinas himself thought that the aggressor forfeited his rights by his aggression. And really, the Catechism hints at this when it says that legitimate defense does not violate the principle of not directly taking innocent human life. Legitimate defense does not violate the principle of not directly taking innocent human life. So where does all of this leave us? We are, by the way, at paragraph 2263. Well, legitimate defense is morally upright when there is an aggression either taking place or imminent, and the public authorities are not present in sufficient strength to protect the innocent. If the aggression has ceased, any action other than that of the authorities would be retaliation, and therefore it would be morally wrong. But in legitimate defense, the intention is to save the life or protect the person of the innocent, not to harm or kill the aggressor. The force used is proportionate. It is what is judged necessary and no more. So legitimate defense, my friends, in other words, resisting by force and killing if necessary, would be justified even if the person were not morally culpable, say because of mental illness. Now, why is that true? Because a deliberate attack on the innocent would still be taking place. Legitimate defense cannot, however, be used as an argument for a deliberate abortion, as we shall see in a little bit of time. Now, legitimate defense and the death penalty is somewhat of a burning topic today, and we have to look at this whole topic in light of church teaching. The Catechism does it by turning to the protection of the common good against an unjust aggressor. It is the purpose of governments and those in legitimate authority, we are told, to protect the life of the innocent. This includes prosecuting offenders and punishing criminals. Justice requires that the decree of punishment should reflect the gravity of the crime. There are three purposes of punishment, and these three purposes of punishment are identified in paragraph 2266. Stay with us, and we'll take up our topic once again in the next segment. There are, as we said at the end of the first segment, three purposes of punishment that are identified in paragraph 2266 of the Catechism. Punishment redresses the injustices which are committed. Punishment should deter people from offending, and punishment should seek to reform the guilty to live in peace in society. The first point the Catechism tells us is the primary one. In the case of unjust aggression, society has a right to be protected, and the aggressor should be rendered unable to inflict harm. That is achieved, of course, by punishment, not excluding in cases of extreme gravity the death penalty. Not excluding in cases of extreme gravity. Notice what we're saying now. In cases of extreme gravity, the death penalty. This is not a wholesale endorsement of capital punishment. Anything but. It would limit capital punishment to extreme cases, and it does not say that it is necessary everywhere, even in the extreme cases. So we have to be very, very careful on this and follow it up with church teaching. John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae takes a very, very similar line. It says that the nature and the extent of punishment should be very carefully decided, and it should not go to the, quotes, extreme of executing the offender, except in cases of absolute necessity, by which it means when it would not be possible, otherwise to defend society. Something very rare, something practically non-existent, given the resources of modern society. The Catechism then takes up the question of intentional killing. Intentional killing. Paragraphs 2268 and 69. And in talking about intentional killing, the Catechism returns to St. Thomas Aquinas' key distinction between intentional and unintentional killing. The Catechism, as you might very well know, condemns direct intentional killing of the innocent. This is murder. It means intentionally acting so as to bring about a person's death, or acting in a way which exposes them to danger of death indirectly. Positively speaking, this means deliberately putting someone in danger of death without grave cause. And the Catechism tells us one can actually break this commandment by not acting against what threatens life. Deliberately not to act is itself a moral act. And it's a moral act for which we would be responsible if we deliberately did not act when we should have acted. Unintentional killing is not normally imputable. In other words, we are not normally responsible. A sheer accident, for example, in which a child is killed while the driver was driving carefully and could not have helped it, absolutely could not have helped it, is an instance. Yet unintentional killing is morally imputable. It is indeed morally imputable when we have acted in a way which has caused someone's death without grave reason. An example of that would be, I suppose, a landlord who fails to repair or replace a faulty boiler, which will kill a tenant. Or a driver who drives after drinking and kills someone. Or someone who's driving at excessive speed or otherwise dangerously. So there are examples, and plenty of them, of unintentional killing which are morally imputable to the person. Beginning in paragraphs 2270 to 2275, the Catechism takes up then the topic of the human embryo, and very specifically the topic of abortion. The starting point for the Catechism is the proclamation of the very positive truth that I'm quoting now, that human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception. It then says, the Catechism then says, that the human embryo from conception should have its rights as a person, should have his rights as a person recognized, including the inviolable right to life. The embryo is not a potential human being. The embryo is a human being with potential. Very, very, very important point. The embryo is not a potential human being, but a human being with potential. It's very vital for us to realize that the Church's magisterium is not making a scientific statement here. The Church's magisterium is making a moral statement. The Catechism does not say that the embryo is a person, but it asserts the basic right to be treated as a person. And this is a very important point. Moral theology, our Catholic moral tradition, has long taught that in cases concerning the presence or absence of human life, it is always necessary to take the safer course, because to treat the embryo as subhuman would be to risk murder. Then we move into the topic of procured abortion. In the Old Testament, new life was seen as God's blessing. And nowhere in the Old Testament are children anything other than a wonderful sign of God's goodness and His blessing. And the New Testament, quite obviously, has the very same view. And from the beginning of the Church, Christians were very, very distinct from others. Now, by others, I would mean pagans living in the Roman Empire. in that Christians did not kill newly conceived or newly born children. They did not practice abortion. They did not practice infanticide. For example, the Didache, which we quoted many programs back, a very early Christian document from, about 100 A.D., condemns both abortion and infanticide. So the condemnation now of procured abortion has been constant in the church's history. There have been differing opinions about when the soul enters the body, but these debates have not affected the church's teaching. They have affected only the penalties for abortion. Holy Mother Church, my friends, recognizes the tremendous pressure exerted on women and on girls today to have abortions, reasons of health, anticipated handicap. Despite it all, she teaches very, very clearly, whatever the motivation, abortion remains a grave, grave moral disorder. Now, we have direct and indirect abortions. Directly procured abortion is condemned. The Catechism repeats the total rejection of every direct abortion that is willed either as an end or a means. Now, what about indirect abortion? This is something which is unpacked in paragraph 2263. 2263, and it would be well worth anyone's while who's following this course to look at the Catechism's treatment of indirect abortion. We are speaking about a situation where the death of the unborn child is not willed either as a means or as an end. Not willed either as a means or as an end. For example, a pregnant woman with a cancerous uterus could have a particular therapy or even a hysterectomy, if necessary, for her survival. Now, if there were a fetus very near to viability, if she were carrying a fetus, a child near to viability, it should be removed beforehand and immediately given life support. Where there is an embryo, the mother's operation would mean the death of the embryo. Here is a case where the one act would have two effects. Only the good effect, namely saving the mother's life, would be intended. The evil effect, killing the child, would be foreseen, but would not be intended. The good effect would not be obtained through the evil effect. In other words, her acting like this to save the woman's life. The abortion would be indirect, and with all four conditions of the principle of double effect met, would be morally licit. Now that is quite a complex piece of moral analysis, and I hope you paid attention to how slowly I read it. Go back and read 2263, if you will, particularly if you did not get anything I was saying there in that slow reading. Paragraph 2272 talks about cooperation in abortion, and it makes note of the fact that it is not just the mother who has the directly procured abortion who does grave wrong. Anybody who knowingly encourages, pressures, arranges, facilitates, or conducts the abortion, if they realize that it is very wrong or contrary to God's law, is involved in formal cooperation in this grave moral wrong. Anyone involved in formal cooperation in this grave moral wrong have themselves committed a very serious mortal sin. Not every form of cooperation is formal cooperation. So we have formal cooperation, and we have something which would not be formal. I don't even want to call it informal cooperation. When we return in the next episode of this series, we're going to take up this specific, we're going to begin with this specific and continue from there. I encourage you to please stay with us for our next episode. Join us as we continue our consideration of the fifth commandment. Please join us as we continue our discussion of the fifth commandment. Hello, I'm Father Charles Connor from Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and I want to welcome you back once again to our course on the Catechism of the Catholic Church and to the continuation of our discussion on the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. We saw in our last episode there are tremendous ramifications of this commandment. There's all kinds of material that are directly associated with this rather simple sounding statement, but nonetheless, when one begins to unpack it, one sees so very much at issue in our contemporary society. We left off in our last episode talking about direct versus indirect abortion. And then the very last point we made was the one on cooperation in abortion. So we are beginning our discussion in this program with that today. Paragraph 2272 in the Catechism. If you're following along, I hope you've grabbed your catechism for the show once again. The topic then we're beginning with cooperation in abortion. And the very last point we made in our last program was that it is not just the mother who has the directly procured abortion who does grave wrong. Anyone who knowingly encourages, pressures, arranges, facilitates, or conducts the abortion, if they realize that it is very wrong or contrary to God's law, are very much involved in what we refer to as formal cooperation in this grave moral wrong. Any of them and all of them, fitting those circumstances, have committed a very serious mortal sin, even though they did not have the abortion themselves. Now, not every form of cooperation is formal cooperation, and that's the point we left off with as well. For example, were a nurse to find herself in an operating room and discover in the course of the operation that it was an abortion, she might judge that her departure would endanger the woman's life, the handing over of the instruments and so forth, provided that she made known her objections later and tried to ensure that such a situation would not arise again. She would be involved not in formal cooperation, she would be involved in what we refer to as material cooperation. In no sense would she be condoning what went on, and therefore she would not be sinning in that kind of a case. It is also the case that people working in general hospitals, cleaning and doing general nursing and the like, who do not become involved in abortions as such, are not involved in any kind of formal cooperation in the evil. The Church, imposes the penalty of excommunication on those who have had abortions, those who conduct them, those who formally cooperate in them. This occurs when and only when. This occurs when and only when all the conditions for mortal sin have been met. A grave matter. It must have been done knowing it was gravely wrong and with true freedom and knowing before acting that there was indeed a penalty of excommunication. So all of those criteria have to be fulfilled before one is actually excommunicated after having had an abortion. Civil law and the unborn child is another interesting topic taken up in the Catechism, where the civil law allows what is immoral. Now, that's a great part of the world today. Civil law does allow what is immoral. And where the civil law allows what is immoral, our duty is to not avail ourselves of that permission. In other words, no Catholic, and for that matter, no Christian, no upright person who perceives in conscience the truth about the human embryo should make use of the legal permission. This permission cannot confer a right in any proper way whatsoever, since it is in violation of the law of nature and of the revealed law of God. And because it's in violation, it can never be construed as a right. Extremely important point. Then the discussion moves to the integrity of the human embryo. The moral obligation, we are taught in the Catechism, that the embryo is to be treated as a person from the moment of conception, certainly has implications for prenatal diagnosis, for experimentation, and even for therapy. In paragraphs 22, 74, and 75, the Catechism summarizes the teachings of Donum Vitae. Donum Vitae, you know, was the document of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which was written in 1987. And these are the major points Donum Vitae gives us as Catholics to follow. First of all, prenatal diagnosis is morally acceptable if it is conducted in the interests of the embryo. We'll say that again. Prenatal diagnosis is morally acceptable if it is conducted in the interests of the embryo. Prenatal diagnosis is gravely wrong if the intention is to abort the fetus in the event of any anomalies being found or suspected. Found or even suspected. If that's the motivation, prenatal diagnosis is gravely wrong. Therapeutic procedures, that is, procedures aimed at protecting the health or saving the life of the particular embryo or fetus in question, are indeed morally upright. Experimentation on the human embryo is very problematical, of course, because of the fragility and the risks involved. The Catechism refers to such risks in embryo therapy in general. They must be proportionate. That is, there must be a realistic hope of success, and the burdens must not be too great. Where there is no other way of dealing with a major problem, the use of drugs not yet fully tested can be licit. But there should be no experimentation. There should be no experimentation on embryos or fetuses, which is in the interest of science or of other embryos. That would be to use a human being merely as a means to an end. And it is unacceptable. From there, the Catechism moves on to talk about the problem of euthanasia, 2276 to 2279. Begins obviously with the Christian perspective. The Catechism reminds us that we need to look at this particular moral issue as indeed we look at all issues in the light of the gospel. For so many of our contemporaries in the world today, suffering seems entirely useless and death is sheer annihilation. So it's not surprising at all, that many of our contemporaries in today's world see no other solution whatsoever than ending an existence which looks utterly pointless. And we are taught that Christians may never, ever, ever, ever see death or suffering in those kind of terms. We must never see death or suffering in those kind of terms. The Christian faith sees death as the way to eternal life and to the perfect fulfillment of an earthly existence. And it sees suffering as having tremendous value in opening us to the fulfillment that we can find only in God, when we freely unite ourselves with Christ to the Father, not in despair, but in hope and love. So, we turn then to the actual meaning, the meaning of euthanasia, as it is defined in the Catechism. Euthanasia means putting an end to the lives of the suffering, the disabled, or the dying by acting or by omitting something. By either acting or by omitting something which itself causes death or is intended to cause death. That definition, by the way, is given in paragraph 2277. That people do this out of a mistaken sense of compassion does not alter the fact for one moment that it is murderous. You can't use any other term to describe it. It is murderous. It's not enough to consider motivation when assessing the morality of an action. The Catechism rather goes on to say that euthanasia violates human dignity and it usurps the right of God the Creator. It violates human dignity and it usurps the right of God the Creator. It is something requested, but it is also at times imposed, and that makes it even worse. Even where it is requested, a person does not have the right to decide when to leave this world. You and I do not have that right to decide when to leave this world. God is the sole Lord of life. And we need to remember that a person's request may come from depression, it may come from anguish, or it may even come from a sense of being a burden to others. All of these various psychological reasons that get into a person's mind can serve as a basis for euthanasia in their minds. And they may very, very well be treated at the psychological level to convince them of the wrongness of that kind of thinking. Here, psychology can do a tremendous amount of good. Now, a psychologist coming in and telling the person he or she is right is doing no good at all. But if they may even be shown rather from a psychological level how wrong that thinking is, then this particular discipline can do tremendous amounts of good. They can certainly be shown from a spiritual level and from the household, from the vantage point of the household of the faith. They absolutely can be shown from a Catholic perspective how very, very seriously wrong this kind of thinking is, how we are not the masters of our own destiny, how God is indeed the captain of the ship, and we are the passengers traveling on board that ship, and it is up to God and to God alone to determine when we are going to leave this valley of tears and move to the next life which He has promised for us. Hence, all the misdirected compassion in the world is not going to make this action right. Never did make it right and never could make it right. It is rather the Lord Himself who summons each of us in our own due time. If you stay with us now, we will consider other ramifications of the fifth commandment as soon as we return in just a few moments. The Catechism next moves into what is described as ordinary and extraordinary treatment. We are at paragraph 2278, and it's a very, very important passage because the alternative, I should say, to euthanasia can sometimes be caricatured as keeping someone alive as long as possible. And that is not the Church's position. Modern technology does allow people to be kept alive a good deal longer, but the Church distinguishes between ordinary treatment, which is morally obligatory, and extraordinary treatment, which is not morally obligatory. Euthanasia, therefore, has to be distinguished from decisions not to proceed with therapy which is not effective and which has become very, very burdensome. And it's here that some confusion can arise. While a life support machine may be ordinary treatment after major surgery to help the patient through post-operative trauma and the like, that same machine is extraordinary when it's not helping the patient to recover, where it is associated with the collapse of major organs and the like. It may then at that point be discontinued, the Church teaches. The decision should be that of the patient if he is competent, but of his legal guardians or next of kin if he is not competent. This is not euthanasia. The intention is to accept the death which is occurring and which the machine is merely deferring, as opposed to switching off a machine in order to bring about death. And that is a very, very vital distinction. There is a strong condemnation in the Catechism of suicide. Suicide is against the natural inclination to self-preservation. It is against the proper love of self. It is against love of neighbor because it cuts family ties and ties of friendship. It is certainly against God as the Lord of life. Well then, also in the fifth commandment, we move into other areas you do not always think of. For example, beginning in paragraphs 2284 to 2287, we have, the title is Respect for Human Dignity, Avoiding Scandal, avoiding gossip, avoiding all of these things. There is a real gravity to scandal. It involves leading another person into committing a grave offense. It could very, very, very well. The person causing the scandal is in a position of authority. He's ruining the reputation of another. A person causing scandal has the responsibility of teaching others by nature or by office the correct way. A person was more directly responsible for bad example, whatever the situation might be, that person would be guilty of scandal. The victim of scandal, the person who's led astray, is very, very weak and has been led astray by someone who has been the source of scandal. It's very well developed in the Catechism, just as is the question of social, institutional, and legalized scandal. And much, I would refer you there to your own personal reading. Paragraphs 2288 to 2296 talk about the principles concerned with respect for our health. Life and physical health, we're told, are precious gifts of God. They've been entrusted to us. We are to take reasonable care of our life, reasonable care of our physical health. Sounds like a vague statement, but it needs to be read in connection, this is 2288, in connection with paragraph 2289, where our bodily life is stated not to always and everywhere be absolute. We are to take into account the needs of others, and the principle of the common good demands that the economic system, food distribution, employment opportunities, wages, social security, and so on be arranged efficiently so as to ensure the basic needs of life available to us all. Catechism then, 2290 to 91, talks about temperance. Very, very clear on the right and appropriate use of food, drink, and drugs. From there, we move into the question of the experiment upon the human person. Justified experiment and some general principles of justified experiment. On what basis does the Church consider some experiments on the human person to be licit? Science and its applications are in themselves morally acceptable and to be encouraged as signs of man's dominion over creation. They are to be used as resources at the service of man. They are to foster man's integral development, Science and technology must respect the inalienable rights of the human person. There are justified and unjustified points of experimentation, which are brought up in paragraph 2295. Experimentation is not justified without the informed consent of the person himself. The second point is, consent in itself is not enough. If something is wrong, my consent will not make it right. And thirdly, experimentation is not justifiable if it exposes the subject's life, physical integrity, or psychological integrity to disproportionate or avoidable risks. The topic of organ transplants comes up. This is in 2296. The first point the Catechism makes is that informed consent is necessary. And the second is that risks for the donor and the expected good of the recipient are indeed to be proportionate. Then the Catechism talks about respect for the human body, takes us into the realms of violence toward the person, surgical procedures, the respect due to the bodily remains of the human person who has died. And Christian anthropology and the human body is a very, very beautiful section indeed. The Christian understanding of the human person gives us the only secure basis on which to address these very, very different moral problems. We are taught once again, we're made of body and soul. We're a unity. We have an integral vocation. We have a threefold relationship to ourselves as body and soul, to others, and to God. Catechism then takes up violence to the human person. Beginning in 2297, we see the Church's teaching on, and we can almost guess the Church's teaching, on kidnapping and hostage-taking, on terrorism, on torture, all connected in some way, shape, or form with the Fifth Commandment. Beginning in 2297, the important topics of amputations, mutilations, and sterilization are brought up. And the principle at stake here, the moral principle, is obviously that which is called the principle of totality, which states that the part may indeed be sacrificed for the sake of the whole, the limb for the life or for the health of the same person. Therefore, if one needs an amputation and the like, there is indeed justifiable reason. A sterilization is something else again. Sterilization necessary, for example, to prevent the spread of cancer or otherwise medically necessary, could in cases be morally acceptable. These procedures of sterilization are actually based on the principle of double effect. What is done is itself good. The good effect is directly intended. The good effect is not obtained through the evil effect. And there must be a proportionate reason for the action. No less drastic action which avoids the evil effect is available. Respect for the dead is talked about in paragraphs 2299 to 2301. The dying person is to be commended with the sacraments, the last sacraments, and with prayer. The body of the deceased is to be treated always with the sublimest dignity. Then the Catechism moves into the question of human life and the meaning of peace. And we have other aspects related to the Fifth Commandment discussed in paragraphs 2302 to 2306. The roots of conflict and violence, we've seen them before. Anger, hatred, and contrasted with anger and hatred, peace and respect for life. Peace and respect for life. What's necessary for peace? Protection of persons' goods, free communication, respect for the dignity of persons, respect for the dignity of peoples, and the assiduous practice of fraternity. Peace is seen as a gift of Christ. 2307 to 2330, we take up the topic of war and the respect for human life. Legitimate defense by military force is discussed at great length. The topic of our own national defense as a country. The accumulation, production, and control of arms. What do we read? The arms race does not ensure peace. The accumulation of arms risks increasing the danger of war. The diversion of resources to arms production impedes efforts to aid the needy, and by implication risks furthering injustice, which may itself then foster war. And finally, it increases the reasons for conflict and the dangers of conflict. And finally, we are given the topic of morally responsible attitudes and the promotion of peace. These are topics well discussed over several pages of the Catechism, and topics that you do not always and everywhere immediately associate with the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And yet, the more you think about them, they are directly related to thou shalt not kill, and they deserve a very, very careful read from the pages of the Catechism. There we have them all explained to us in great detail. Time constraints in these programs obviously means that we can't go into each one of these topics in great detail, but we refer each and every one of them to you for your own reading, your own study, your own meditation. Very timely, very contemporary, extraordinarily hotly debated among the men and women of our age in the 21st century, and all answered from a Catholic perspective here for us in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So we have covered much material in the fifth commandment, and in our next episode we'll be talking about the sixth commandment and the moral life. We encourage you to please join us then.